Hello, everyone. So we're going to start today's workshop. Welcome to Workshop Wednesday. We are glad to have you here with us to talk about the career path of a scientific journal editor. Before we start today's conversation with our panelists, I want to briefly introduce the people and the work behind this workshop and the entire Workshop Wednesday series, as well as provide you with a general flow of today's event. Today's workshop has been organized by GSA's Career Development Subcommittee, and Nonia here has really put together the blueprint of this event, and I'm co-hosting with her. But every member of the committee showcased here has been instrumental to make this event happen. Also, a special thanks to Jessica, the Acting Director of Engagement for the Early Career Leadership Program, for providing us with the essential technical coordination to our planning. The Career Development Subcommittee helps build relationships with professionals and companies in the larger scientific community to create deeper connections with the society and its members, and to showcase the versatility of career paths open to all of you. The aim of today's workshop is to highlight the experiences of scientists who transitioned outside of academia and pursued a career in scientific journal editing. Last but not the least, I want to share a few notes and ground rules with everyone in attendance today. Please note that all views and opinions shared in today's workshop are those of the panelists themselves and not of the organizations that they represent or have worked for. In addition, any mention of a company by a panelist is not an endorsement for that given company or brand. This workshop is a safe space, so you're welcome to ask honest questions to our panelists by dropping them in the chat box addressed to everyone. However, if you are being disrespectful in this space, we will have to ask you to leave the workshop. So please be mindful of others. Members of our committee will be collecting questions from the chat box, and if they are not addressed in today's discussion, don't worry. We will make sure to provide answers after the workshop in the form of career resources. You do not need to frantically write down notes or resources. All the resources that will be mentioned today will be collected and compiled by our team and will be sent to all participants after the workshop. So let's begin today's discussion by first allowing our panelists to briefly introduce themselves by telling us what they do and how they got to their current position. So starting with Dr. Kusumika Mukherjee.
Hi, welcome to everybody. I am Kusumika Mukherjee, currently the editor of a to-be-launched open access journal from CellPress, tentatively titled Cell Reports Methods. Before that, I was an editor of a reviews journal, Trends in Pharmacological Sciences, again with CellPress, for about 3 years. I came to this position from a postdoc at Mass General Hospital, where I was there for 3 years studying craniofacial genetics and development biology. And I got a PhD before that from University of Utah in biochemistry, where I studied zinc finger nucleases. And I look forward to engaging with all of you.
Thank you so much, Kushi. The next panelist that we have is Dr. Nonia Pariente.
Hi, hello everyone. I'm Nonia, and so a very brief bio is that I trained as a virologist in Spain and did a PhD in viral pathogenesis and lentiviral vector development. And then from my postdoc, I started my editing career already a long time ago. And initially at Embo Press in Heidelberg, I was reviews editor, and then manuscript handling editor, and then senior editor. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about the different editorial roles that are possible. And I moved to Nature Microbiology before it launched. So I was on that launch team. I also worked at Nature for a while and ultimately became chief editor for Nature Microbiology. And almost a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, I moved to PLOS Biology as editor-in-chief.
Thank you, Nonia. And the last panelist that we have for today is Dr. Mirna Kvajo.
Hi, my name is Mirna Kvajo, and I'm a chief editor of BMC Biology. I've been in this position for about 4 years now. Before that, I was a scientific editor at Cell Press, also for about 4 years. I came to Cell from a postdoc at Columbia University Medical Center. I was working on neuroscience and kind of models of psychiatric diseases, mouse models. I'm a cell biologist and a molecular biologist, so I have a PhD in cell biology from University of Basel in Switzerland, and I'm originally from Croatia. So
Thank you so much, all of you, for introducing yourselves. So we will now begin with our question and answers. The first question is, what made you decide this was the right path for you? And when during your scientific training did you realize you wanted to be an editor? So Kushi, would you first like to answer that question for us?
Sure, thank you. I'm going to first answer the last part of the question is, when did I realize I wanted to be an editor? Frankly, till I didn't get the job, I didn't realize that I wanted to be a scientific editor. This was a very organic evolution of my job search. I first went to a career panel just like this one, full of scientific editors. In about third year, the second penultimate year of my postdoc, just because I wanted to check out what are the other careers beyond being a PI and an industry scientist. I heard that, what kind of qualifications are needed for this job, who all people are behind the science publishing. I learned a lot from that career panel and decided to look up what all jobs are available around the Boston, Cambridge area. Saw a posting in Cell Press, applied. And during the time of the interview and the written and all the processes, I realized that I really would enjoy doing this kind of a job. And then when I landed this position, I was very happy.
Thank you for answering that. Nonia, would you like to answer the same for us?
Yes, I think for me, it was a case of realizing, so I was at the end of my postdoc and I had kind of this decision of, should I become a PI or try to become a PI, go back to Spain? But I had spent a lot of time helping my PI, my boss at UCLA, apply for grants. He was quite successful, so it was not as bad as now, but still, already then it was clear that as a PI, you would move away from the bench and spend a lot of your time providing for your lab, right? And so I thought, this is not really what I want to do with my life. And for my life, what interests me is science. And what drove me to this type of career is that I was, I felt a little bit asphyxiated in my niche project, and I was very interested in a variety of science. And I talked to some editors. So one of them came for a site visit at UCLA, and then at meetings and so on. And I knew that people often came to me to ask me, can you read through this manuscript before I sent it? And I had actually the advantage or the privilege that my PI was an editor for an academic journal, for the Journal of Virology. And although it ended up being very different from what my job ultimately was, I gained some experience with him and so on. And yeah, so I then, people knew that I was interested, and someone forwarded me a job opening that was circulating around Spanish institutes that EMBO was looking for editors. And the rest is history, as they say.
Thank you for your answer. Mirna, would you like to answer the same?
Yeah, similarly, I did a postdoc, and I was, during my postdoc trying to figure out what to do next. I think maybe there was a little bit of a default type of idea that I would, stay in academia and become a PI. When I really had to start thinking about it and applying, I just realized I think somewhere along my postdoc, I think I lost a passion for just this type of career trajectory. So I started looking around and thinking, okay, what else could I be doing? And the interesting thing is that, I did attend a couple of different, type of career panels and so on and so forth. And I remember when I saw applications, when I saw open positions for editorial positions, and I think those were at Cell Press. I think there was one for Neuron, and then there was some for Cell, and I think for Cell Reports. And I was really excited to apply for those. It was just like a very genuine excited. It fills you after a period of kind of, a little bit of a stagnation, and when you reach kind of what you already know in your postdoctoral position. So I just, essentially did what I was excited about. I mean, I don't think that that's something that should drive anyone or everyone, but for me, it was easy. I started applying for this position and was very excited when I landed the one itself.
Thank you for answering that. The next question that we have is, did any specific mentor's advice help you along the way? Kushi, can you answer the question for us?
Sure, happy to. So I was very lucky to have a bunch of great mentors. Incidentally, all of them were outside the typical academic environment. I did a short science communication internship from with AdGene. It's a company out in of Cambridge, and I've met several scientists there who were kind enough to discuss about alternative careers, things you can do with a PhD, which is not necessarily being a PI. I also joined a career group where out of Mass General Hospital, which is where I was doing my postdoc at the time. And there were two mentors who were connected to the industry. So they brought in a lot of feedback for me. What happened through these talks is that it was a time where I spent time looking at what next and kind of away from my postdoc projects. And that really helped me understand that, I really need to think about what are the other places I would feel comfortable. And then eventually all of this happened, and they were a very big support while I was doing all of that.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to point out to Mirna and Nonia, if you would like to add something at any point, please feel free to unmute yourselves. The questions are very randomly addressed to all of you. So the next question that we have is, what do you enjoy the most about your job? Mirna, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, I think, and again, maybe this is a little bit personal, but something that I really enjoy about my job is, I mean, being a scientific editor at Cell and now being a chief editor, which are actually quite relatively different two roles, is just the I think potential for growth, or the growth itself that you experience. I think something that is interesting about these jobs is that you actually get to do, things that are quite different and that require, a very, there isn't a lot of routine there, and there's a lot of very different things going on that you have to absorb and learn and do. And I think many jobs start off that way, but this job is such that you actually just keep on doing this and keep on kind of dealing with new situations. I think it has a little bit to do with this slightly complexity of the job, because this is a job which is on one hand very scientific, but on the other hand is also very people oriented. And I think when you deal with people, when you deal with people who passionately care about what they do, I think that's really the type of situation where you're just going to have many, many different things to learn.
Thank you, Mirna, for sharing your experience. Nonia, I see you unmuted. Do you want to add something?
No, sorry, I was unmuted from before. But
yeah,
I mean, for me, it's also it's a passion for science, and what drives me is helping the communities, communicate their research, making the research process easier. One thing that I think the whole industry is kind of changing, but when I started in 2007, this was, not the case. There was a lot of ivory tower scenarios where, this was a black box. You sent your paper, and people were kind of afraid of editors, and editors were very entitled. And being part of the movement that really opened this up, where now editing is a conversation between authors and editors and reviewers and so on. While at EMBO, we implemented a lot of transparent review process, reviewer cross-commenting, scooping protection, things that I think improved the process very much. And so that is something I really like about the job.
Thank you so much. And I would ask you to keep yourself unmuted, because the next question I'm going to ask you, which is, could you briefly tell us how your career in scholarly publishing started and evolved? What led you from one step to the next?
Sure. I think there's this, always, as in life, a bit of serendipity and a bit of luck, but you have to be, you have to grab the opportunities as they arise in a way. So as I said before, I was thinking what to do, and an editor came to UCLA who turned out to be my colleague because she worked in Nature Immunology, and so many years later she became my colleague. and discussed about the job. And so I started putting out feelers that I was interested. So a friend of mine that was postdocing in Madrid sent me this advert, for editors. And so I started as a reviews editor, but was really interested in handling primary papers as well. So we, I actually was part of a team that drove a change on how we worked in Ember reports, and then all of us did review, front and back half. That was nice. And then, of course, as you become more senior, you obtain more responsibility. So that helps you shape some policies at the journal. This is very nice. But this world is rather small. I mean, it's increasing with the number of journals, but it's relatively small. So what happened, and for my next big step, was that I was at a meeting with another editor that I knew from Nature, and she said, hey, Nature is about to launch Nature Microbiology. I'm sure they're going to be looking for editors. Why don't you apply? And so I emailed, before the ad was even out, I could email the person who I also knew and who was going to be the chief editor. That's how I got, then I had to go through the whole application process, but I might not have even realized there was this opportunity. And then it just so happened, my boss, the Nature Microbiology launch chief editor, left the profession. And there was this opening, so I applied, and the PLOS biology was an interesting story, because I had essentially almost just begun, and I had just put forward my vision for Nature Microbiology and was starting to work on it, and they came to they got in touch with me. We are looking for an editor-in-chief. Would you be interested? And that's what I mean. You have to also be able to grab opportunities as they arise. So, I weighed plus and minuses of going back to not-for-profit publishing, which is where I started, of going to open access, etc. And in the end, I took the plunge. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Nonia, for sharing your experience. Mirna, do you want to add something to that? How was your journey?
Oh, well, my journey, I mean, I guess I can say, yeah, I was at Cell, and I think I just enjoyed that job very, very much. It was very, manuscript oriented job. So really a lot of primary, a lot of working on primary manuscripts, and really meeting a lot of scientists. And it was just a very, very immersed kind of day-to-day, very intense job. I think I did realize along the way, that there were obviously, like for everything, that there were some things that you are kind of more interested in than others. And I was, and I just felt that I was also interested in, kind of strategic questions of, how to improve publishing, how to, how this whole interaction with the scientific community goes, and, whether you can shape it beyond, I guess, handling the papers, which is already an important point. And yeah, I've seen an opening for the position on which I'm currently, which is for, a BMC Biology chief editor. And, there were other chief editor positions at the time also open. And I just thought it was a good opportunity to apply, because, I just felt that there was a possibility to essentially start shaping a journal itself. And as I said, I was also interested in kind of growing in that direction, and so that's kind of what informed my decision.
Thank you for sharing how your experiences have evolved over the period. The next question that we have is, do you miss the bench? So Kushi, first, would you like to answer that question?
Yes, sometimes. So if there's 100% of how many times do I miss it, probably 10 to 15%. A classic case of my missing bench was when there was like a newsletter kind of a thing happening in Boston, Cambridge area when the COVID pandemic hit, and people wanted molecular biologists to come help so that, the tests were could be geared up. And I really, at that point, I was already away from bench, but I wanted to sign up because I missed the bench. That being said, I do think that I am not too far away from the bench. So I have a very unique perspective on what the authors are doing, because I've been a bench scientist for a long time with a PhD and a postdoc, approximately 7 to 10 years there. And I get to read every day multiple things of what is coming out of the bench. So not too many times, a little bit here and there.
Thank you for answering that. What about Nonia? Do you miss the bench?
To be fair, I don't really miss it very much. When I do, I bake and cook because it's following a recipe. I somehow think actually that after some years as an editor, one would be a much better PI. And so now I miss the possibility to pose questions and think, you know, this is a cool direction, or you get to see synergies between different fields and much better. And so I think sometimes that's a little bit of what I miss more than the actual bench. You know, but then I have a lot of, you know, my partner and a lot of friends that are active scientists. So maybe you can just talk to them and say, well, this is cool. Why don't you, you know? So yeah, short answer is not really.
Thank you. What about Mirna?
Yeah, no, not really. I also don't miss the bench much. There are some aspects of I think working in academia that are quite different than, you know, working. I mean, there are many aspects of working in academia that are quite different from this current job, and there are some aspects that I miss a bit. You know, I think the kind of I think also the ability to kind of really become really very much a specialist in some aspects, or become very, very kind of understanding very deeply something. That's something that as an editor, you know, it's not, especially as an editor of a broad interest journal, such as the ones that I always worked on, you know, being at CEL and being at BMC Biology, that's something that you typically don't do. You know, you will not gonna become kind of an expert specialist in something you might, but that's not very common. So that's a little bit something that I miss sometimes. I agree. I think there are some kind of, as Nonia said, like some opportunities, you know, you can kind of start thinking, oh, you know, in this job, you can become, I think by virtue of the job, you get to maybe become a pretty decent in interacting with people, hopefully, maybe managing people, maybe, you know, just understanding, being in some sense, hopefully a more empathic person in some way. And then just thinking back, oh, you know, actually some of the things that we learn in this job would be actually good to apply on a lab position. But yeah, I'm not tempted.
Well, thank you. So moving on to the next set of questions, which are more focused on your daily responsibilities as a scientific journal editor. The question is, what does a scientific editor at a journal do? Could you also define the difference between a staff editor and a volunteer editor? So Nonia, can you answer that question?
Yes, and I think I'm going to also try to bundle a few things I've seen in the chat now about open access versus not, and not-for-profit versus for-profit and stuff. So I think one big distinction is professional editors versus academic editors, right? So professional editors are editors whose full-time job is to handle manuscripts, and they get paid to do so, a full salary, and are not research scientists simultaneously. And some journals run 100% on professional editors, and there the editors make all of the decisions, whether or not to send a paper out for review, which referees to involve, etc. There are also journals where it's a mixture of both. PLOS Biology is an example where there's a team of in-house editors, but we also have academic editors that help us assess the science. And there, I don't think, you know, we have time, or the idea is to go very nitpicky into different models. At PLOS Biology, the editors do the initial assessment, the staff editors do initial assessment, but there's a consulting academic editors essentially. And then there are journals where there are other type of editorial positions like managing editor or executive editor, but that then are run apart from this exclusively on academic editors. And these are researchers, most often volunteers, sometimes paid a little bit, that as a side job, apart from being PIs or industry scientists in some cases, or museum scientists or whatever, do handle a few papers and read them and decide whether or not to send them for review, etc. And so within professional editing, there's also a myriad of editing possibilities. So you can be editor of reviews, editor of front half of journals. You can be graphic editor. So this is something that not so many people know about, but but if you are good with graphics and graphic design, you could be an art editor for a journal, making figures, etc. There's copy editors which go through accepted manuscripts and read for text and flow and accessibility, etc. And what I am going to get a little bit more in detail about is what a scientific editor does, which is normally receive manuscripts that are submitted to the journal, read them, decide either alone or in consultation with the team whether they meet the basic criteria of the journal to be considered further for publication, and if so, then decide on shortlist referees and procure referees, and then receive the reports, make decisions based on the referee reports, receive revisions, etc., and then prepare public papers for acceptance, which entails usually one or the other type of metadata and reporting checks. And so, although most of editorial positions don't require a lot of public-facing writing, for example, they do involve a lot of writing and communicating in written form with reviewers, with authors, with academic editors, etc. And then just very briefly, there are fundamentally two different publishing models at the moment, which is subscription-based and open access. So for the first time this year, the volume of open access publishing has surpassed subscription publishing, but both are very much still in the industry. So that is something that normally does not affect the editorial job per se, but of course you can be working for a journal that is open access or mixed or subscription. And then also somebody was asking in the chat, there are organizations that are not for profit, and this will include a lot of academic societies where money is reinvested in the society, and for example places like PLOS. And then there are companies that publish and have journals and run journals, etc. And those are for profit, just like any other company like Google or Apple or whatever is also for profit. Right?
Thank you so much, Nonia, for describing in detail about all the different roles that are in scientific editing. Since this is a more popular question, Kushi and Mirna, do you have anything to add to it?
I mean, the only thing that I would add is that I think for some jobs there may be different qualifications needed. So like copy editors, I think typically don't have a PhD. I think, but I saw at most positions. So, and I think those jobs that you will typically see advertised, generally speaking, as a scientific editor or as a, editor, I'm just thinking now, associate editor or assistant editor, depending on companies and so on, how they are, I think they would probably be this type of scientific editor jobs where you will be handling papers and doing all of the things that Nonia described. But I think that being said, I think the interesting thing is that there is, something that people, once you maybe start working for a company which has this, which for a publishing company or for a journal, you actually realize that there's so many different things going on in the back, from editors, which are graphical editors, do a whole lot of jobs in production, which people don't know much about. The jobs that have to do with workflows, jobs that have to do with processes, quality control, and so on and so forth. They're not really directly related to science, to maybe what people start off as scientists off the bench. But I think there are a lot of different opportunities that one actually learns. And so I think that's something that you may not see advertised, but these jobs exist, and you learn actually on them on work, sorry, once you join.
But sometimes they are, and I think, you know, I think it's really good what you said, because it's totally true. But sometimes people don't realize. So, for example, some advertisements are for managing editor, and these people usually do not handle papers at all. So it depends on what journal you're applying to. I think that you just have to look at what the publication model is of the journal that is advertising, let's say.
Yeah, and I think the important thing is, when you read an ad, I mean, I think this is a kind of interesting bit. I don't know how much we'll have a chance to talk about when you start applying, when you start looking around and figuring out where the positions are. You know, read really carefully what the job is about, like that line by line, what are the expectations, what are going to be your duties and things like that. That's where really the part that it's going to tell you how you fit into that might be. But yeah, you know, I think talking to the three of us, you know, we are like the garden variety of editors, the scientific editors, and that's typically where postdocs actually first go, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree with both of you. What you have said, I think those are great suggestions. I will add, though, that there are many people who have come to me and said, well, I was approached by so-and-so for being a book editor out of Elsevier. That is another, it's a type of editor. Now, book editors are not generally scientific editors off the bench with some amount of postdoc or not. These people do not handle peer review. They don't handle, you know, they don't publish any peer-reviewed articles. So like Mirna and Nonia both said, it's very important to look at the requirements for the job listing to decide whether or not you would be a good fit and whether, you know, you want to do that kind of a job.
Thank you so much to the three of you for sharing that. The next question that I have is about your work-life balance. How does that look like? And has that changed over the period from when we have moved from on-site to virtually? Kushi, since can you answer that for us first?
Sure. Frankly, the work-life balance is the way you would want it, because this is generally a very flexible type of a job, in the sense that what you have to do is open up your computer, get connected, look at the papers on the EM, and then take it from there. So I would say the work hours are flexible. If you're working on a team, of course, you have to keep it in mind that there are other team members who might be globally in different places, different time zones, but there is an understanding when the team works. That being said, I personally feel there is a lot of work. We get lots of emails, lots of manuscripts, a never-ending chain and cycle of things we need to do. So if you get too much into it, the work-life balance gets out of the window. So there is a push from the company. Many companies are doing that, especially in the COVID era, is that, you know, you have to take a step back. It's so easy to lose that work-life balance because you are always tied to the computer. So that's why I started by saying that it is what you will make it. The advantage is that you're not tied to a bench, so you don't have to be cooped up in a lab or plan experiments and stuff like that. You can get your work done the way it is best for you, but the work is not less. It is significantly there.
I mean, I would just say that it is a question. Sometimes I got this question, people, you know, kind of wondering whether this is very conducive to, say, part-time job, part-time work and things like that. And I think typically it is not. The positions that we have, we are really working. I mean, I would say, you know, as Kushi said, you know, I mean, it's actually it's a very pretty intense job. It's a kind of job in which you have continuous influx of things to do. And you know, usually kind of in a quite rapid succession, and you know, it is not. And I think, while there are some jobs which are maybe a little bit more freelance or working for specific companies and so on, where maybe you can kind of, you know, pick how much of a workload you're going to have. In this case, yeah, I think it's important to know how to structure your work so that it doesn't become all-consuming, but the workload is there. And you know, as it is, you really work. I think that's a bit of a different that I found from academia, is in academia, maybe you will work, with your PI, with your colleagues. You might be kind of associated with some grant work writing or things like that. But, there's going to be a limited number of people who will be kind of expecting things from you, and with whom you're going to be kind of really, there is going to be kind of this expectation process. This job is a job which connects you to very many people, and in which, I think it is a job where you will be just, communicating. You will have, managers above you, will have other people that you may be working with or maybe managing. There's going to be a whole lot of different other areas. So it is not, I guess what I'm trying to say, it is a job which is a pretty intense one. And the workload can be large. I'm just saying this because I think, frankly, it is not like if you're kind of feeling that academia is putting a lot of kind of demands on or work or kind of workload on you, this is not a job where there's going to be less of that.
Yeah, no, I always say that, when you're sitting career panels and you have someone from industry and someone from consulting and someone, most of the time they come and say, the pace is less and it's 9 to 5 and whatever. And I think there are advantages to editing. I love it and I would do it all over again. And flexibility is, as Kusi was saying, is one of them. And you can organize your day. And of course, there's the stability of not depending on a grant or whatever, but it is a high intensity and high paced job, and the demands are there that you are going to have to respond. And so you won't work less, but you will work for a more stable income and in a different way. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
One last point I wanted to add, I think, kind of building up on both the other panelists, and that is what I found was, and this came up a little bit before also, is that this is a high stakes situation for authors and reviewers, and so you're putting yourself in a war zone. I kind of feel like I'm always in a war zone because all these people who I'm interacting with, they have high stakes in there. They want the paper published. You are telling them that it's not kind of in your journal, to take it elsewhere, and there are other emotions involved, and so that also puts a lot of pressure here, if you will take it as a pressure, is that you're continuously, apart from the science part, you're continuously you're having that customer facing role, which adds on to the intensity of this position.
Yeah, I agree. And one thing I would say is that, and I think this is probably another question, but it fits here well, is that I think one of the things to keep in mind, and maybe the most negative sides of the job, at least as I've experienced it, it really depends, because, for example, reviews editing is much more creative, and since a lot of it is commissioned, and you can reject, of course, commissioned manuscripts, but it's a less percentage. But if you're a scientific editor for a selective journal, you're rejecting roughly 85 to 90% of submissions at one stage or the other of the publication process. And so you spend really a lot of your time explaining to people why this is not a good fit for the journal, which can be really taxing, especially because sometimes it's extremely good work, right? So I worked at Nature for over a year, and you can imagine that Nature rejects excellent papers, right? And so, and you guys have worked at Cell, etc. It's the same situation. And so, you have to somehow have the capability of this not bringing you down, and also keep the target in mind. And maybe that's why we end up where we end up. I'm really comfortable now at PLOS Biology, where we can publish all of the great work, whereas in other journals there are other constraints and other considerations, and you have to make different decisions, right?
Very true. Yeah, I mean, I think I couldn't emphasize more that that really I think there is this idea that you're actually making some decisions that are very impactful for people. And when I was starting as a young Cell editor, I think also just the idea that you actually might be, obviously, publishing a paper in a high impact, highly selective journal. Say, these days, I mean, hopefully, maybe. I should say maybe a bit less, but at some point people felt very much this as a kind of make or break deal for their career. I think many postdocs and many students feel that way, and it might be really true. And it is just that, you come fresh off the bench and you still carry all of those feelings and all of those emotions on being on the other side experiencing, how you are gonna, what's gonna happen if you publish that paper, where you're gonna publish it, and so on and so forth. And so then, you start this job, and it is a question of really, actually, it is an emotional thing of realizing that, that is, knowing that because we really experience, that's a special thing a little bit about this job. We experience both sides, right? You experience the publishing side from being a postdoc or a student, and then you become an editor. And I think, this kind of duality, or this seeing both sides, I think it's a great thing for your outlook and perspective on doing the job. But at the same time, it can be just stressful. And I think many journals, I mean, I'm not going to say, I think it's not negative. I mean, many journals really have, and teams, I think teams of editors tend to be really quite tight-knit often. I'm not going to say that that's a general feeling, but I think they do tend to quite support each other and feel very strongly for each other, because we all know, and professionally speaking, also think when you meet other editors, maybe of other journals at conferences and so on, I think there's just a lot of kinship in understanding, also the what I guess also the responsibilities that go with the job.
Thank you so much to all of you for answering that. So we're going to move on to the next set of questions, which are focused on how to become an editor for a journal. The question is, what are journals really looking for in prospective editors? For example, is the postdoctoral experience really needed to become an editor? And also, does other attributes such as not being a native English speaker impact that process? So Nonia, would you like to answer that?
Sure. I mean, the second one is quite obvious. None of us are native English speakers, but we all can communicate proficiently in English, which is what's required, right? You have to demonstrate proficiency in command of English, but you do not need to be a native speaker. And I think we're going to talk about the process of applying and so on. There are a lot of tests. It's a really lengthy process. There's lots of different things that are involved, and so it will become clear whether you have the level of English required. And whether or not a postdoc is required, I think for most positions, it always says it's not required, but it's encouraged. It really depends which journals. The journals I have worked with almost always hire postdocs because there are postdocs applying, and if you have a choice, normally you would prefer somebody with postdoctoral experience. It's important, I think, for editors, and depending on the journal, the degree of selectivity of the journal and etc. It's more important or less, but that you have experience, as Mirna was saying, the other side, right? That you will have that empathy and that understanding of what publishing is from the other side. And so having a postdoc usually means you have changed somewhat fields or at least angles of looking at projects. You have a wider breadth of techniques that you maybe have changed countries, so you know about scientific philosophies in different parts of the world. And all of that increases your outlook on how you will judge science, which is in the end what you're doing. Having said that, I know, there is, so the Nature, the chief physical sciences editor at Nature doesn't have a PhD. So, there are exceptions at all, in all places, and new journals that are just opening often sometimes hire people directly from PhDs. I think not having a PhD is really odd. It's an oddity in this time, in this day and age. Normally, everybody has a PhD and often a postdoc. I
wanted to say something. I think along everything what Nonia said is that, you know, that's such a common question, right? I think there are a lot of PhD students who realize at some point that they actually don't even want to do a postdoc because they don't see themselves in academic careers. And they say, do I really have to do this like year or two just to put this line on my CV and so on and so forth? And you know, as Nonia said, I mean, there are objective reasons why you know, journals like to have postdocs because of the breadth of experience and so on. That being said, I think that kind of points you a little bit in the direction of, you know, how to tackle this question if you are applying from a PhD and you are not interested in doing a postdoc or not willing or able to do a postdoc. I would say, you know, the question there is really to demonstrate you know, how did you acquire this breadth of knowledge, which is one of the things that editors are going to look for in people that they want to hire. The breadth of knowledge, maybe breadth of experience, this kind of maybe, you know, some sort of a sense of a maturity in understanding, you know, kind of how scientific fields work, how scientists think and work and so on. I think I think, you know, that's something probably that you may want to think how to, you know, is that a way to express this in your cover letter? Is there a way to express maybe through your CV? If you get to the interview stage, or if you talk with someone, you know, who might kind of, you know, interview you informally or something like this, I think that's an important point, you know, and I just feel that, you know, kind of showcasing the diversity of experience or the ability that maybe you I don't know, collaborated with someone. Maybe you know, there are other ways. Maybe you worked outside of academia in some sense or shape. There are some ways in which you can really kind of demonstrate the things that people acquire with the postdoc. But I would also urge, I mean, and that's aside, but I would also urge people who really feel that they don't want to do a postdoc because they think it's a line on a CV. It's not. I think you can gain a huge amount out of a postdoc if you have a goal down the road.
I agree. I mean, having said all of this, I've you know, just hired somebody who had deposited their PhD but not defended, and he defended while I'm the PLOS biology team, and at Nature Micro also there, you know, we hired someone straight out of the PhD, but they, as Mirna was saying, demonstrated outstanding capacity during the process. And a keen, broad eye, you know, and command of the fields that we were looking to hire expertise in, etc. So it is possible.
Well, thank you so much for answering that. The next question we have is, how does the interview process work? Can you explain how you applied and prepared for it? Kushi, can you please answer that?
Sure. And Nonia, I think, touched a little bit on this, that it's a very lengthy process with multiple steps. And I believe that it differs a little bit between journals and depending on which position you're applying in, what kind of journal. So obviously a more established, high impact journal like Cell would have probably a little bit more lengthier type of an interview process than a newly launched journal. It also differs significantly, I can see differing significantly across different scientific publishing houses. I can only speak for CellPress because both of my jobs at this point are in CellPress. So how that starts is you apply and it goes to an application pool. You go through a screening phone interview, which is usually by one of the HR people. You are then, if you are selected, usually you probably would make through that step. Once you are recruited from there, you move on to a written test. At this point, you usually do not interact directly with the hiring manager, with probably the EIC of the journal or the publisher of the portfolio, but you will be sent this written test. The written test would have different types of questions like, you know, pick out papers in the last 12 issues of the journal which you think are bad or good, or what are the strong points, weaknesses, things like this, which are basically geared towards understanding whether you have the appropriate scientific breadth of understanding the papers. There are no right or wrong answers from my understanding. They're trying to kind of delve a little bit into what type of a person scientifically you are. You send in that written test, and then you make it to the next step. The next step comes as probably a Zoom call at this point, because everything is COVID during COVID, there is no in-person, but there are varieties of tests here. Somebody calls it the manuscript test. Some people call it abstract test. It's basically the journal team getting involved at this point, and they would be sending out a couple of papers which are either in-house at that journal or different other journals, and the editors are actually looking at it, and they want to hear what you think of those papers, why you think it's a strong paper, why you think it's a not a so strong paper, scope, does it fit A journal or B journal. They want to talk to you on that level to see when you come in as an editor, does that, do they jive as a team with you? Again, so this is a time limit, so many people are afraid of the manuscript test, I've heard. So usually 3 papers, they're given in a like 1 hour before the Zoom call, and then within that 1 hour you have to read through those papers, make those points of strength and weaknesses, and these are papers which are not necessarily on things you have worked in your postdoc or doctoral studies. They might be completely out of your area of expertise, so that is what they're trying to see is, are you able to learn very quickly or read through the papers very quickly and understand the main points? And then you talk to the team either or the EIC via the Zoom call. That is like probably an hour or so. And then probably there would be an on-site interview or another more informal interview where they want to check your personality. If you have any concerns, you can talk to them. So yeah, those are the major steps, I would say, you would have seen. There was another part of the question, was it that how did I prepare for it? I didn't. I had just gone to the career panel. I'd learned a lot from the editors. And I just went, I applied, I got selected, I went in, I wrote out my written test. Didn't think I would get selected, but I did. And then I moved on and I went to the interview where one of the editors asked me a question about, you know, who are the competitive journals which fall in the scope of this journal? And I had no clue. So I learned that I should have probably had an answer to that question. I didn't get selected in that job, but I applied to another one where I knew the questions. So it was kind of learning while I was interviewing. Probably not the best and the most constructive one, but that's what happened to me.
Yes, I was going to add just that part of the, I mean, the processes that I've been exposed to, part of the interview, so after the manuscript test interview, which is very similar. I mean, I've been given slightly more time potentially, but very, you know, like 3 papers in 1.5 hours or whatever. And then the manuscript test, which already takes about an hour. And then there's another interview, but rather than it being just kind of a how do you fit in, it is really kind of in depth about your understanding of the scientific publishing landscape, you know, emerging themes in whatever area, big labs in that area. If you could do a site, if you could visit, you know, one question I love. So if anyone interviews with me can expect that if the world was your oyster, who would you visit, right? What kind of meetings would you go to? And what we're looking there is for breadth of interest and breadth of knowledge, essentially, right?
Well, thank you for answering that. And while we are talking about the application and interview process, there is a follow-up question to that. So does your immigration status have any influence over the process and how it may or may not impact? And this is open to all 3 of you, whoever would like to answer this.
I mean, I can answer very briefly. I mean, I think obviously being, being in the States, I think on J1 visa, for instance, or being on a H1B visa, I don't know actually what kind of, you know, situations, immigration situations people will these days encounter. But I think at the time, the publishing, I think Cell Press was one of the places where actually as a postdoc, they would really kind of consider you without requirement for a green card. That was the situation that was at the time, and I think it was actually one of the few industries, I think, and I'm talking maybe about you know, I don't know, some 8-7 years ago, and so I think that was you know, so I think that was a kind of a really good thing because you could apply even though you were a foreigner, and there are many companies which would only be interested in people with green card. That being said, Yeah, I think that many of these details are often spelled out in the ads for the jobs sometimes. And I think it is helpful to actually, yeah, to see very specifically what the ad says and what are the, whether they're looking, say, for citizens of a specific country or something like that.
Yes, I agree. I think that, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Nonia.
I was just going to say that really depends on the company and the historical moment. But normally the ads do say whether you require, I mean, I don't know about in the US a green card, but at least sometimes they require that you have, that you can work in the country. So even in nature research, it really depended because it depends on the money available. And right now, sometimes there was money to sponsor visas, but sometimes not. And also sponsoring visas is a very lengthy process. So that is also another issue that as a hiring manager, even if you can sponsor a visa, if this process is going to take 6 months and there's another candidate who can work in the area, then it puts you at a slight disadvantage. But some companies will sponsor visas and some won't, and it's usually quite clear in the ad.
Yeah, I'll kind of give a slight update on the CellPress one. So I kind of agree with both of you. It is more, CellPress is more open to visa situations. There are lots of foreigners coming in, applying, but given the recent, in the last 3-4 years, immigration has been tough, very, very tough. And so the visa has also become very tough. Even during my tenure, I've seen that visa applications have had issues getting, accepted. So CellPress has slightly probably moved away a little bit from being that open. Many of the jobs these days which are being posted states clearly at the bottom that you would have to have a work authorization to work in US. But there are other places like CellPress has an office in London. There is one in Amsterdam. So people from there, those countries are being recruited to those positions because it is easier. Because do you want to wait 6 months or go through the hassle of getting a visa for a person, or do you want to recruit somebody equally qualified out of Amsterdam office? And especially given the fact that these are global teams we are working on as editors. So I think the industry has become slightly more closed than it was previously. That being said, it still remains more open than other ones where you would probably not even make it through to the next step without a green card.
But I do agree with Kushi that I think that there's a possibility of working out of many different offices in most large companies. And so, even if you don't have authorization in the US, if you can work in, out of a Chinese office or out of a continental European office. Now with the UK is a big problem because of Brexit, but, even PLOS is going to try to have a continental European legal entities to hire because that has become constrained. There was another question that I wanted to, because I think it fits here, whether of remote working and not. And I think this also depends very much on the company, but also companies are evolving, and companies that were more closed to it or to restricting it rather strongly are now more open given the new realities. So I do think that this is something that is flexible in most places, and that they would probably require an initial training period in office if the office is actually open, but we're now recruiting everybody without an in-office training period, obviously. But then after that, remote working is a possibility in many places.
Thank you so much to all of you for answering the questions, and we just have 1 minute left, so we're going to end today's workshop. So thank you again for being with us today, to all the attendees, and also thank you to all the panelists for taking out their time to share their experiences and provide their valuable insights in so much in detail. Yeah, so stay tuned for the next Workshop Wednesday series events, and also keep an eye on your emails because we will be putting a resource package together. So there were a lot of really good questions. So if anything we haven't been able to address in today's time period, we will make sure to address them in our resource package. So lastly, the Career Development Subcommittee will be putting together a resource package, as I mentioned, and please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, and also check your emails for updates as soon as we start distributing them. Thank you, everybody, once again, and please stay safe.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. This was great. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Best of luck for the future.
Thank you.